Morning. It's May 19th. We are very fortunate to have Rick Richman with us. He's written many books. The one we're talking about today is None Shall Make Them Afraid. And let me tell you a little bit about him. He is a resident scholar at American Jewish University in Los Angeles. Super thanks for waking up early. It may be 10 here, it's 8 a.m. there. He has written for Commentary Magazine, Mosaic, the New York Sun, the Jewish Journal, Jewish Press, New York Post, PJ Media, and other publications, and is the author of Racing Against History, the 1940 Campaign for a Jewish Army to Fight Hitler. And he graduated from Harvard College and NYU Law School, and he lives in Los Angeles with his wife, Judy. He has also written, oh God, I gotta get to this here. Oh, I know, I wrote it down here. He has also written What America Owes the Jews, What Jews Owe America, and of course, the book that we're going to be talking about today. So really, with no further ado, I'm going to, Rick, you can take it away, and we can't wait to hear from you.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Thank you. It's not that early here. And thank you for taking your mid-morning to be here today. Okay, let me explain a little bit about how this book evolved into what it is, and then we'll cover a couple of the 8 people that are really the subjects of the book. It started out, I was just looking at individual stories because I was researching Zionist history, and I was coming up with people, and some of the names I knew, but I was amazed when I looked at their stories because they were different than I knew. Some of them I didn't know, and I was amazed that I didn't know them. I would always come home to my wife and after researching and say, how come I didn't know this? And I have a short answer to that maybe I'll cover later on. But after I got this finished with the stories, I realized that if I put them in chronological order, I would effectively have a history of Zionism from Herzl back in 1895 all the way up to 2015 and beyond. So 125 years of Zionist history viewed not from 30,000 feet as these great themes of diplomacy and war, Zionism, and things of that nature, but from the ground up with looking at individuals who devoted their lives to trying to realize a Jewish state. And seen from that perspective, the story was much more real to me than it was the way I had been taught in school. And so I put them together, and chronologically, they form that story. And then I realized that there was an even bigger story involved in these 8 people, which were 4 of them were born and raised in America, and 4 were born and raised in Europe. And the story became for me a story of the alliance in the 20th century of Zionism and Americanism. Americanism defined as the American civic religion of freedom and democracy, and Zionism as the attempt to create a free and democratic Jewish state. So there really was an intellectual as well as a diplomatic and political alliance in the 20th century that accounts in large part for the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. And then I thought, there's some broader lessons even than that about Jewish history that one can draw from these 8 stories. And maybe when we get to the end today, I'll give you at least a few of those lessons. So let me turn to my first slide and show you the 8 people that are that I'm covering. Let's go one more slide to there we go. Those 8 people, some of them you know, some of them you may not. Some of their stories you may think you know, and I can assure you you don't. Starting with Theodor Herzl, whom everybody knows. But everybody thinks, or at least most people still, that what happened with Theodor Herzl was he was a journalist in Paris. He was a foreign correspondent for a Viennese newspaper. He watched uh, Dreyfus and covered his trial, covered his degradation after his conviction, and realized that anti-Semitism was not going to go away and wrote his historic pamphlet, The Jewish State. That's really not what happened with Theodore Herzl. He was a foreign correspondent. He was there at the time, but like everybody else, he thought that Dreyfus was guilty. And when you look at his diaries, his private diaries, when you look at the reports he wrote for his newspaper, not a shred of doubt about Dreyfus's guilt. So it was not until 3 years later that Émile Zola wrote J'accuse, that everybody knows about, accusing the French government of covering up the actual story about Dreyfus. But that was not what led Theodore Herzl to become a Zionist. And then there's Louis Brandeis, whom everybody knows as one of the most famous and consequential U.S. Supreme Court justices. He was on the court for 23 years. But I believe, and we'll discuss this a little bit in just a bit, that his historical importance in terms of his impact was actually more on the American Zionist movement than it was on American law. And so that's quite a tall statement and quite an achievement. If I can support it, we'll cover that in a few minutes. Then you've got Chaim Weizmann, first president of Israel, the state of Israel. But he started off growing up in a shtetl in Russia. It had no post office, no newspaper, no roads. It was so small that he said it wasn't even a town. It was a townlet. And he spent his first 11 years there until he then was sent alone by his family to go to high school in Pinsk. And then he studied, eventually became a PhD in chemistry, got to London, was influential on the Balfour Declaration. And in 1948, there he is standing next to Harry Truman, as Truman recognized the state of Israel. Vladimir Jabotinsky it's hard to categorize him. He was a playwright. He had plays on the Odessa stage before he was 20. He was a novelist. He was a journalist. He was wrote nonfiction books. He wrote essays. He's the main force behind the creation of the Jewish Legion, the first organized Jewish military force in 2 millennia. And he also led one of the branches of Zionism. Extraordinary individual. Golda Meir, everybody knows her as the 71-year-old grandmother who became prime minister. But the really interesting story, at least to me, is about her growing up. The first 8 years, she wasn't Golda Meir. She was Golda Meibovich in Kiev. And her father left after the pogroms in 1903. Went to America, got to Milwaukee, got a job as a carpenter, and 3 years later sends for his wife and their 3 daughters, including Golda, who walked to the border. Can you imagine that? A mother and 3 young girls walking to the border, getting out by paying bribes and assuming false identities. And that was the easy part, because now she had to get to America with her children, and she got there. And she gets there, she gets to Milwaukee, and it's an extraordinary place. It's freedom. She's been in the most anti-Semitic autocracy in the end of the 19th century, and there she is in Milwaukee. She sees her father marching in the street um, on a parade of workers, and she sees police on horseback on either side, and she thinks they're going to whip the demonstrators and arrest them, because that's what would have happened in Russia. And instead, they're protecting the demonstrators. So she's in a paradise of freedom and democracy. And she decides to go at age 23 to Palestine because she wanted to further Zionism and socialism, her two goals in life. She took her husband against his will to Palestine. He was perfectly fine in Milwaukee, but he went with her. And 50 years later, she becomes a prime minister. Ben Hecht was the highest paid screenwriter in 1940 in Hollywood history. He had single-handedly created a whole genre of American film, the gangster movie. The first Oscar for a story treatment went to Ben Hecht for one of his gangster movies. In 1940, he meets an associate by chance of Jabotinsky, and he had no interest, not just in Zionism, no Jewish affiliation, no religious beliefs, no nothing. And he's a successful Hollywood screenwriter, and Jabotinsky's associate turns him into a Zionist. And the story after that is quite remarkable. Then Alba Eban, we all remember, some of us at least, remember his great speeches. But we may not remember that he was appointed 5 days after Israel declared its independence. He's aged 33. He's a professor, former professor of Jewish literature, Persian literature, and Arabic literature at Oxford and Cambridge. 33 years old. He's sent to the UN Security Council. Israel's on attack on three sides by five armies. He's got to present Israel's case. There he is in the Security Council. He's the youngest representative in the entire UN. He gives a speech that electrifies the people who heard it at the UN, the people in Israel, the New York Times, everybody. And it's the first of 25 years of speeches that had people comparing him at the time to Churchill. And when you read his speeches, you see it's not hyperbole. He's an extraordinary speaker. And then Ron Dermer. Everybody asks me why Ron Dermer's in this book. He's the only guy. The seven in front of him live full lives. They're dead. They were historic individuals. Ron Dermer, he's a political aide to Bibi Netanyahu. He's still alive. He's in the middle of his career. What's he in there for? It's not for political purposes, because two other people who aren't on this list are David Ben-Gurion and Menachem Begin, from the left and from the right. They're not on the list. The reason they're not on the list is we all know about them, and there's been a lot of books written about it. Both of them don't need another book from me. These people, at least these stories, I felt we did. So let's go to the next slide, which is the same people, but with their cities. Go back one slide, Vanessa, if you would. Okay, there we go. Those are the cities in which they were born or raised. And what you will notice if you look through it is no two cities are the same. 8 different cities on 4 different countries in 3 different continents. And what kind of people who are a statistical blip in the population of wherever they are produces these types of people over this geographical range. And they, in one way or another, devote their lives to creating a Jewish state and are instrumental in creating a modern miracle. And now go to the next slide, and what you'll see is what I've done is I've broken them down between the ones who were born or raised in Europe and the ones who were born or raised in America. And it's an even split. And it was accidental. I didn't realize it when I was starting out on it, but it illustrates that this was a joint venture in the 20th century between Zionism and Americanism, between Jews, extraordinary Jews from 4 different countries, creating the state of Israel. Okay, so I'm going to cover 2 people. Oh no, yeah, 2 people. First with Herzl. On the next slide, you've got on one slide his sort of accomplishments. When he wrote the his pamphlet, The Jewish State, he was 35 years old. He was the literary editor of the New Free Press, which was an influential paper that was read all over the continent of Europe. But he's the literary editor. Nobody expected that he would become a historic figure in Jewish history when he was age 35. And then he writes this pamphlet, and then he organizes 6 Zionist Congress. He ends up over the next 9 years negotiating with kings, princes, ministers, the Sultan, the Pope, and then he dies suddenly in 1904 at age 44. 9 years of extraordinary effort that changed Jewish history. Okay, if we look at the next slide, you'll see the opposition to Herzl. He had enough opposition outside the Jewish world. Nobody was going to give him a Jewish state just because he asked for one. But within the Jewish community, you had Orthodox rabbis who thought he was rushing the end. You were supposed to await the Messiah. It was sacrilegious to try and push it forward and before the Messiah came. So they opposed him. On the other end of the spectrum, Reform rabbis wanted nothing to do with all these ancient rituals that we had outgrown. We were a modern, rational religion. We did not want an ancient state. We wanted to be a religion like the other religions of the 19th and 20th centuries. Then you had Jewish philanthropists who had given millions of dollars trying to establish places for Jews to go in Argentina and other places, and they had been completely unsuccessful after devoting millions of dollars to it. I won't say completely unsuccessful. Thousands of people benefited from their relief, but it wasn't the idea of creating a Jewish state. They thought, look, we can't do it. You're not going to do it either. Then you had socialist Jews who believed that nationalism was reactionary. They believed in international organizations and class solidarity across national lines. The last thing they wanted to do was go backwards towards nationalism instead of forward towards internationalism. So they opposed a Jewish state. Then you had assimilated Jews who were afraid of charges of dual loyalty. They were reasonably comfortable in the West in where they were, and they certainly didn't want their position in their resident states to be challenged. And then Jewish public leaders, they just thought the whole idea might be a great idea intellectually, but the whole idea was absurd. So why were we spending time on it? That's what Herzl, an individual, was up against when he wrote his pamphlet. So this next slide is a year and a half after he writes his pamphlet. This is what he's got. He's got a Zionist Congress where people have traveled from all over the world to come and discuss for 3 days the idea of a Jewish state. And it's held in Basel, Switzerland. It was moved at the last moment from Munich, Germany. Munich was the perfect place for it because there was a huge Jewish population. It was easy to get to, whether you were coming from Russia or from the West. There were all kinds of shuls and kosher restaurants. And at the last moment, it was the Jewish establishment who said to Herzl, "You're not having it here. It's just going to make trouble. So you got to take it somewhere else." And at the last moment, he moves it to Zurich, to Basel, Switzerland. If you know Switzerland from a map, it's not even convenient within Switzerland to get to Basel, much less from where people were coming, as opposed to the last moment. So he moved it. And he got 220 delegates. There's a lot of people there because he got the press there. He was a journalist and a former playwright, so he knew how to stage and publicize an event, and that's what he did. So I want to tell you one story about one delegate because there were 5 from America, and on the next slide you'll see one of them, who was Rosa Sonnenschein. Rosa Sonnenschein. Ah, I mean, this. I wish I had enough material on her to devote a chapter to her because what an interesting person. She was a Rebbitzin, got divorced. She moved to Chicago from Missouri. She starts the first American magazine for Jewish women called The American Jewess. She's supporting more involvement by women in Jewish ritual and in synagogue management. And she decides to go to the first Zionist Congress. And the archives of the American Jewish are online, so I could read them and get her contemporaneous report on what it was like to go there and experience the first Zionist Congress. And I trusted her report more than I did secondary reports, because those are people, usually they've got a perspective there, but she was doing it in real time. And imagine what it took for her to get there. She had to go from Chicago to New York. There weren't any planes. She had to go across the ocean. It was at least a 10-day trip by ship. She had to get across an entire continent. Then she got to Switzerland. And she gets down to Basel. And she writes in her diary, this is something where the people, this movement could really be something. It's very inspiring to read what she wrote. And she writes that the one thing that she was upset about, and she took it to Herzl, was that they were delegates. There were 15, I think, women delegates, but they couldn't vote. And she went to Herzl and she said, that's not right. And Herzl, to his credit, the Second Zionist Congress and everyone after that, the women as delegates voted. And you think, well, okay, big deal now of course. But realize that this was 20 years before women got to vote in the United States. And so Zionism and Herzl himself was a liberal movement, a progressive movement, not just for Jews, but for women as well. Okay, on the next slide, I want to, we about 5 or 6 years ago, the first translation of the proceedings at the first Zionist Congress were published. So you can read all the speeches, all the reports, everything that happened over 3 days. And like Rosa Sonnenschein's diaries, it's remarkable to just read these things because you're seeing Zionism in real time and how it emerged. And the eloquence of Herzl in his speech is quite extraordinary. And particularly with what he was dealing with when he says, look, our Congress will live on eternally, restoring to all Jews their dignity and making them worthy of a history whose glory, if perhaps now faded, is nonetheless imperishable. So that's what he was accomplishing against all that opposition as a single individual. It's a remarkable story. And on the next slide, I've got this is from the Fourth Zionist Congress, and it's part of his speech to that Congress. And he says, this will give you an idea of his eloquence, but also there's some ideas in here. Our reappearance in the land of our fathers, prophesied by Holy Writ, sung by our poets, yearned for amidst tears by our stricken nation, jeered at by miserable scoffers, that return is a matter of political moment to the powers that have interests in Asia. And the extraordinary insight that Herzl had was this wasn't a charitable operation. This wasn't a relief operation that he was trying to organize. It wasn't simply going to a land. It was rejuvenating the Jewish people, and that he thought that the great powers, the empires of the world, would be interested in it because it was a strategic place. And the British Empire, the Russian Empire, the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the empires that ruled the world, could not allow one of the other empires to take over this strategic area. But Herzl would go to them and say, well, what about a Jewish state? We won't have an allegiance to any particular empire. We want our own state. That's all we want. We're the best people to actually have in what was called the Near East that time because we won't threaten you. And he made these political arguments to all these foreign potentates, and it was extraordinarily effective with them. And then, but he was the subject not only of opposition, from outside the movement for all those people who thought it was problematical or crazy, but within it. And in the next slide, I've got a paragraph from his private diary, June 1st, 1901. This is during one of the Fifth Zionist Congress, and he's getting opposition from people in the movement. And he just writes, this is never published in his lifetime. He says, perhaps a fair-minded historian will find that it was, after all, something that a Jewish journalist without means, in the midst of the deepest degradation of the Jewish people, in a time of the most sickening anti-Semitism, was able to create a flag out of ragcloth and a nation out of a foundering rabble, a nation that flocked to this flag with straightened backs. That's what he's writing to himself. And it's actually, we look at it and I think we say, my God, what he did. He was saying, you know, I haven't been successful. I've been working on this for 4 or 5 years and nothing has happened. But maybe in the future they'll think it was something that I did what I did. And then on the next slide, you'll see with what he did, which is the David Ben-Gurion announcing or declaring independence of Israel, May 14th, 1948. And there's Herzl right behind him. And on either side of him are the flag that Herzl and one other person co-designed, um, which was the flag he said that people will. He said men need men need a flag. They need something beyond themselves. They need a common symbol. And the flag he designed looks like a talit. It was designed to look like a talit. It had Jewish identity at its center with the Star of David, and it had a lot of white areas to indicate that this was a new beginning for the Jewish people. And those were the ideas that were incorporated in the flag. And 47 years later, you know, there's the Jewish state because of the pamphlet and the efforts that he made. He died, as I said, at age 44. He did all this while having something undisclosed to anybody other than his closest family members, which was he had a heart condition. And some people believe, and I think it's correct, he worked himself to death, literally, for the Jewish people. So that's Herzl. Now let me turn to Louis Brandeis. Brandeis, this is a picture from probably 1939, 1940. He resigned from the court in 1941 after 23 years. He looks like a prophet from the Hebrew Bible, doesn't he? And he was close friends with FDR. FDR, in his private correspondence with Brandeis, started every letter, "Dear Isaiah." Isaiah was what he called Louis Brandeis. And Brandeis graduates from law school. He didn't go to college, go straight to law school, graduates in 2 years, highest grades in the history of the school. He becomes famous and rich as the people's attorney. He's nominated to the Supreme Court in 1916 by Woodrow Wilson. And before he was nominated, Supreme Court nominations were done by letter. The president would send a letter to the Congress. I'd like so and so to be on the court. And it wasn't rubber stamped. There were a lot of relatively high number of people who were controversial and weren't confirmed. But it was done by letter, and then Congress would do what it would do and vote. When Brandeis was nominated, there were 4 months of hearings. The Congress decided they needed a hearing. And Wilson, to his credit, stood by Brandeis, and Brandeis is successfully confirmed. He goes on the court, he serves for 23 years, and he writes landmark opinions in the First Amendment and the Fourth Amendment and federalism and other areas. But as I say, I think he had a more impactful effect on Zionism. So let me briefly tell that story, because it's not this story when he looks like that. It's the one on the next slide. Back in 1914, 2 years before he becomes a Supreme Court justice. And there he is. And and this is the year he takes over the leadership of the American Zionist movement, which has 15,000 people in it out of several million American Jews. Most of the American Jews not wanting to have anything to do with this. But Brandeis, the most famous lawyer in the country at the time, certainly the most famous Jewish figure, um, invigorates the American Zionist movement. And his personal journey is extraordinary. On the next slide, I've got him in 1905. He gives a speech on the 250th anniversary of the arrival of Jews in America. And he gives a speech called What Loyalty Demands. And he says American public life has no place for what President Roosevelt has called hyphenated Americans. And he names it. There's no place for Russian Americans, German Americans, Italian Americans, and he says Jewish Americans, because habits of thought, of living or of thought, which tend to keep alive difference of origin or to classify men according to their religious beliefs, are inconsistent with the American ideal of brotherhood, and they're disloyal. And 10 years later, as I said, he takes over the movement. And on the next slide, this is a quote, probably the most famous Zionist quote from another speech he gives, The Duty of Educated Jews in America. Gradually, it became clear to me that to be good Americans, we must be better Jews. And to be better Jews, we must become Zionists. So he gave the intellectual, the practical, the political basis for the American Zionist movement. And I don't have time to tell the story now. I hope maybe you'll read it. But for Brandeis, there may not have been a Balfour Declaration that the British did in 1917. And the story of his association with Chaim Weizmann and President Wilson and Stephen S. Wise at the time is really an extraordinary story, because Brandeis grew up no Jewish education, wasn't bar mitzvah, never entered a shul, never celebrated any Jewish holidays, and yet he's this amazing figure who agrees to take over the American Zionist movement. And but for him might have been a Balfour Declaration, but for a Balfour Declaration might not have been a Jewish state. So yes, his opinions are extraordinary, and his impact on the court extraordinary. But he's only one justice. And but in the American Zionist movement, he was the person who transformed it. And so, with the result of what Herzl did on the continent and Brandeis here, 47 years later, on the next slide, you'll see Chaim Weizmann, the kid who first 11 years spent in a shtetl in Russia. There he is, standing next to Harry Truman, handing him a small Torah, but it was a historic Torah, because it was written in 1940 on the occasion of a bar mitzvah of somebody, and then donated to the American forces to be used by a chaplain in Europe during the war. And so it was brought back in 1948. Weizmann gives it to Truman. This is like less than a week after Truman has recognized Israel. Weizmann is the first president. And he hands it to Truman, and Truman says, "Thanks. I've always wanted one of those." And so he had a personal relationship with Truman that they could joke in that fashion with him. Okay, let's get to Ron Dermer. I'll cover him quickly, and then maybe we can have some questions or conversation. Okay, this is Ron Dermer when he was appointed the ambassador of Israel to the United States. He's born in Miami Beach, goes to Ivy League school, University of Pennsylvania, graduates from the Wharton School of Business. He's on his way to get a graduate degree in politics and economics at Oxford and Cambridge. And he spends the summer in Israel before he starts his graduate studies, and it changes his life. He sees what's happening in Israel, and he sees what's happening in America. I mean, things in America are fine. In Israel, they're trying to do things that are world historical, and he wants to be part of it. And he eventually ends up as the ambassador to the United States. And that picture there is his official ambassador picture, which you would expect for someone of his position. On the next slide is the official picture from Israel of the announcement in Israel of him becoming ambassador. They're not wearing a tie. They're sitting there on the plane. They're just looking at the computer together. That's the official picture. That's the difference between the United States and America. They don't even wear ties at weddings over there. It's extraordinary. But to become a diplomat of a foreign country in the United States, you have to give up your American citizenship. So that's what Dermer did. He had to make that choice, and he made it. And he needs to sign a form to do that. And on the next slide, I've got the key sentence from the form you need to sign to renounce your U.S. citizenship. It's one page. There's a lot of white space on the page. There's not a lot of legal language. This is as legal as it gets on that page. because they warn you you're giving up your American citizenship. It's a valuable asset. You can't get it back. Are you sure you want to do this? If so, look at this sentence and sign it under penalty of perjury, which Dermer did. And Michael Oren did the same thing. But what Dermer did was he attaches an essay to this one-page form. It's 685 words, and his essay is the reason that he's in this book, because this essay I wanted everybody to read. It is a concise statement of the alliance between Zionism and Americanism, and I've just got really a couple paragraphs, 3 paragraphs on the next slide from this essay. Like you can't imagine how powerful this essay is, but maybe you'll get a taste for it from these 3 paragraphs. He said, for 33 years, I have felt America's warm embrace, and I am eternally grateful for it. I was born in America, raised in America, formed in America, educated by the wisdom of its founders, inspired by the words of its leaders, and protected by the sacrifices of its soldiers. I left America because I wanted to help another nation I love defend the freedoms that Americans have long taken for granted. In serving the state of Israel and working to secure our common future, I will champion those ideals all my life. It's an extraordinary essay. And that's why I wanted him in the book. And the the reason also relates to some of the lessons of Jewish history that I derive from looking at these 8 people, and they're on the next slide. First, people ask me all the time, doesn't this validate the great man theory of history, which was Thomas Carlyle, famous philosopher from the 19th century. His theory of history was that all history is the biography of great men, by which he included women, like Queen Victoria, people of that nature. But he said the great man theory was that the all of history is just these great men playing out their ideas, and the rest of us are along for the ride, that they set the direction. And I come to the conclusion that it doesn't support that at all. What this book and these 8 people support is what I would call the small individual theory of history, which is none of these people were great men in Jewish history at the time they started their Zionist activities. They were just individuals, but they dedicated their lives to these ideals and they changed history. And one of the other things that it shows, all of them, is that words are as important as weapons. These people didn't command armies. They weren't political figures, elected figures. They were people with commitment and ideals and the ability to express them and inspire others. And so that, I think, is the other lesson from Jewish history. And this is why Dermer, another reason Dermer's in there, is that Jewish history is an invisible baton passed from generation to generation across countries, over oceans, to each individual, and anybody and everybody can pick up that baton. And so near the end of the book, I end it with Justice Brandeis's statement that the conclusion he came to is that we're the trustees, each of us, the trustees of Jewish history, charged to carry forward what others in the past have borne so well. And that is why these 8 people, who weren't great men, they were all only individuals, picked up the baton and changed history. So that, sort of in a nutshell, is what the book is all about. I'd love to hear questions or reactions. And
I'm also going to put the link for the book in our chat. I have it right here. It's really a fascinating book, and I encourage everyone to read it. So if you have a question, you can raise your hand virtually, or who's got a question? All right, you all think about your questions. I I let Rick know that I had a couple. So I can't help but ask, if what was the cutoff? So you have 8 stories. Who were 9 and 10? Who got left out?
Um, it got cut off by COVID, actually. When COVID came, I lost my ability, to go to libraries and other places to talk to a lot of people personally. And I wasn't, these were the 8 I had, and they're not the 8. They're 8. I could probably do another book of 8, but I was thinking of 2 chapters when I stopped. One was Jacob de Haas, who was the guy who was Herzl's lieutenant at age 25 in London. He was the head of the Zionist movement in London, 25. That was all Herzl could get. And he eventually went to America. Herzl sent him there. He said, "You speak perfect English. Go to America. We need Americans." And he goes to America, and he's the one who met with Brandeis to talk about insurance law, which was one of Brandeis's interests, and told him about Herzl, convinced him to read what Herzl had written, what others had written, and he probably is the one who converted Brandeis to Zionism. So I was going to do a chapter on him, and the other thing I was thinking of was a chapter on the spouses of these 8 people, because uh, we don't credit the spouses enough, in my opinion, including Morris Meyerson, who was Golda Meir's spouse, and against his will, really followed her the year after they got married to Palestine. And Golda Meir is one of the great figures in Jewish history. If you haven't seen Golda, the movie that came out a couple of years ago, I recommend it. But she was not a great mother, not a great wife, and Morris Meyerson enabled her to become who she was in history by taking care of the kids and staying at home even while she was gone. And the same thing with the other spouses, with Paula Ben Gurion and Vera Weitzman and Joanna Jabotinsky.
Mhm.
These were formidable people whose contribution has not been sung, and and ought to. And I'll just give you one. It's apocryphal story about Paula Ben Gurion, but if you know anything about Paula Ben Gurion, maybe not apocryphal. It's a story about after Ben Gurion's retired. He's no longer prime minister. They're living on a kibbutz, and they're both reading books, late at night. And Ben Gurion's reading a book on the history of the Jewish people, and he puts down the book at one point. And he looks at Paula and he says, "Do you know how many truly great leaders there have been in all of Jewish history?" And she says, "Yes, I do." And he says, "You do?" And she says, "Yes, I do." And he says, "Well, okay, how many?" And she says, "One less than you think." And that was, and that was Paula Ben Gurion. I mean, Ben Gurion during 1940. I covered this in my first book. He was gone for 9 months, and Paula Ben Gurion didn't have a profession, but she kept the home fire burning and kept things going for 9 months while Ben Gurion was off becoming a historical figure. So these stories, and Vera Weitzman was a doctor in Russia at a time when, for a woman to become a doctor, a medical doctor, was an extraordinary achievement in itself. And she enabled Chaim to become a historic figure by what she did. And Joanna Jabotinsky, when he went to America, she was back in London during the Blitz alone, keeping the family going. These contributions are amazing, and so that's what I was working on. That would have been 9 and 10.
Okay, cool. We have a question. How does politics within the state of Israel impact the overall arch of Zionism?
Well, that's a great question. One one of the things I learned from writing the book is Zionism is not one thing. There was labor Zionism of Ben Gurion. There was organic Zionism of Chaim Weitzman. There was revisionist Zionism of Jabotinsky. There was communist and socialist Zionism. There was religious Zionism, of course. There were all these different Zionisms, and they competed intellectually and for money and for followers among themselves. And part of the success of Zionism, in my opinion, is that there wasn't one thing, and you had to sharpen your arguments, and you had to convince people, and you did it not by having a single ideology that people had to sign on to, but by having all these wings of Zionism under a very, very big tent. And so to bring it forward, when you look at what happened with judicial reform in 2022 and early 2023, what other country could have a debate the way Israel had over judicial reform, regardless of which side of that issue you were on? Hundreds of 100,000 people in the streets every Saturday night, and nobody was arrested, much less harmed. The discussion took place, and without any kind of violence, simply by the force of arguments, the government, which had the votes to do it, wasn't able to do it. And that's part of the Zionist heritage, I think, that you're a vibrant democracy. And when George W. Bush became the first and so far only president who has addressed the Knesset, he started off by saying, thank you for your attention. I'm informed this is the first time in the history of the Knesset where everyone has been quiet to listen to the speaker. So that the Knesset itself is this, as we all know, this extraordinary array. There's 17 political parties in the Knesset and something like 5 or 6 in the governing coalition. But that's the indication of a vibrant democracy, and it's the heritage of a vibrant Zionism that never was one simple thing.
With any other questions, I'll continue with mine. With all of the protests on campus and everything that's happening today, I think that sometimes Zionism is conflated with nationalism. And how do you respond to that? And has that had a negative effect on your books, on anything that you do?
Well, I mean, you say that like nationalism is a bad thing,
Right. I mean, yeah, you're right.
The bad thing historically, I think one could argue, has been imperialism, not nationalism.
Agreed.
And in fact, when you even look at what the Nazis were doing, which is usually held up as the worst example of nationalism, it's actually the worst example of imperialism. There's nothing wrong with the German state. What was wrong was a master race that was going to take over the continent and then the world. And that's the same thing we're seeing with Iran. They want a form of Islam that even within Islam, people oppose the Sunnis versus the Shiites, but they want it throughout the Middle East. They want to take over the Sunni states. And so the real danger is imperialism, in my view, not nationalism. Nationalism allows each people to express its identity. And as long as it's within the borders of its own country, it's not a threat to anybody else. And it's a way of developing the human story by treating it as one that it doesn't have a single ideology or a single story, but everybody can contribute their own their own identity to that of the human race. One of the things that Brandeis said was he wanted everybody to think of themselves as a chosen people, chosen to contribute their stone to Western civilization, was the way he put it.
Mhm. We know you don't have a crystal ball, but if you did, what insights can you give us? Because you have a deeper understanding and knowledge, of what do you think is going to happen in Israel, over the summer?
Well, the summer is going to be a very dangerous time because, well, first of all, the war. We're not sure how the war is going. We're not sure what the American reaction is going to be. Israel's currently fighting a seven-front war. The defense minister Gallant gave a speech in December saying it's a seven-front war. It's not just Gaza. It's Hezbollah in the north. It's the Houthis in Yemen. It's the Iran backed forces in Syria and Iraq, and of course, it's Iran itself. So you don't know what's going to happen there. We don't know who's going to be president in January, which is 8 months from now. And a lot of things. I think when we get to the summer, we're probably going to have demonstrations in front of probably both of the conventions, the Democrats as well as the Republicans. And so it's going to be a time of great uncertainty, and a zone of danger, I think, because uh, people may act in different ways depending on whether they think Joe Biden will be president for the next 4 years or Donald Trump will be president for the next 4 years. And so we're not sure. We're obviously not sure how that's going to turn out. We may not be sure until January next year. But a lot of people will have to make decisions, and there will be a lot of confusion. I think it will be a Bermuda Triangle that we have to get through.
Yeah. As you know, you're speaking to Chicago right now, and when I look forward to the convention here, I don't look forward to it because I'm also worried about protests. How does that show our city? We have a fairly new mayor in Chicago. So it'll be very interesting to see what happens over the summer. And I forgot about the conventions. I'm sure that was a Freudian slip.
Yeah.
So I would be remiss if I did not ask you, what's your next book?
Um, I don't know. I've been giving speeches and presentations on this book because I've been um, trying to get people to read this story, since I think the problem, we know the problem on the campuses, but the problem we have as a community is we're sending our kids to college without the intellectual background and the historical knowledge to defend Zionism when they get to college and see this extraordinary reaction to it. And if you don't know your history, you can't defend your identity. So been trying to working on several projects to try and get these stories into high school and even earlier, so that when we send our kids to college, they know enough to say, no, what you're saying about Zionism is not correct, and here's my position.
Yeah.
So I'm working on that. And I got a couple things I'm thinking about, but they haven't progressed far enough for me to make an announcement. So
Okay.
stay tuned.
We are definitely staying tuned. And obviously, even as someone who is responsible for Jewish education for kids low these many years, when I hear either Jewish or non-Jewish kids chanting from the river to the sea, I would imagine most of them, I'm going to say 90, I'm going to go on a limb, 90% of them don't know what river and what sea. And I don't think they know what that means. And if you dig down on our kids, I think they also do not know. I have studied with Zohar Raviv. I don't know if you've ever studied with him. And he said, our kids are like, fish in the ocean. They're up top. But to really know it, you have to dive deep down. And our kids aren't willing to do that for the most part. And
Well, you know what I would say. It's not their fault,
yeah,
because I told you at the beginning that I would come home from researching these stories and say to my wife, how come I didn't know this? I got a great secular education. I got a very good Jewish education, and all this stuff is new to me. How come my teachers didn't teach it to me? And the short answer was my teachers didn't know it either. And the
Mhm.
reason they didn't know it goes all the way back, I think, to right after World War II, when the American Jewish community, I think, was suffering from three shocks. One was survivor's guilt. Second was bystanders' guilt. And third was the sheer shock as the details of the Holocaust became public after the war. And uh, so the Holocaust survivors did not want to talk about their experiences for understandable reasons, and they didn't want to pass that knowledge on to their kids. They wanted their kids to start over. And so gradually these stories are lost. And so to me, it's not a failure of the younger generation to want to learn about these things. It's the failure of the older generation to teach it. And that's understandable because they don't know it. And so there are all these stories. I think, if you read the book, you can pick any chapter, and I think you'll find things that you didn't know, and you'll ask the same question I did, which was, how come we didn't know this? It's such an important and rich history, and it gives you a perspective on Zionism and on Israel that A is quite extraordinarily inspiring, and B is what you need to know in order to respond to these arguments. So take from the river to the sea. No, very few people know that Palestine, at the time of the Balfour Declaration, and in 1922, when the League of Nations endorsed the Balfour Declaration, Palestine was not only all of the area from the river to the sea, the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, it went beyond the Jordan River to the East Bank, because the East Bank was where two of the 12 tribes of Israel stayed. The other 10 crossed the Jordan into Eretz Israel, but two of the tribes stayed back. And Palestine was an area to the east of the Jordan, at least as big as the area to the west. And unless you know that, you don't realize that what we're talking about is splitting up something that was a small portion of what was supposed to be the Jewish state, and which the Jews are now restricted to something that was 15% of what historically the Jewish state was supposed to be, with the other portion, either Jordan as an Arab state carved out of Palestine, or part of the area from the river to the sea, which has been offered literally 6 times formally to the Palestinian Arabs or the Arabs in general as a state and not accepted by them.
Yeah,
So it can't, it can't go through all that history in a short conversation. It would take a book.
yeah.
So
But we have
I'm
one
trying
more
to get,
question. As
sure.
we have discussed Zionism, um, seems to have a negative connotation to the student generation. How would you personally defend Zionism? And I'll add, besides telling them to read the book, um, which is what I would do. But how, as we say, al regel echad, standing on one foot, what would you say?
Yeah, what I would say is that people mistakenly think that Israel was the result of the Holocaust, a sort of guilt gift of Europe to the Jews at the expense of the Arabs. And the truth is actually the opposite. It isn't that Israel is a result of the Holocaust. It was that the absence of a Jewish state produced the Holocaust. And Zionism, although it has a name that's a Jewish name, Zionism, was really a national liberation movement, like the movement that created the modern state of Italy and Serbia and Yugoslavia and Bulgaria and Greece. These were national liberation movements that replaced the empires of the 19th century. And Israel is another national liberation movement, just like the others, with the exception that they were coming to the place where they had had a state for centuries back in ancient times. So you need to recognize that the story is much more complex than simply starting after World War II and thinking it's the result of the Holocaust. It's almost the opposite.
Wow, you've given us so much to think about today. We thank you so much. Go out and get the book. And I just have a quick community announcement. At 4 o'clock, Cantor J is doing Songs of Sondheim. You can register at mymacomb.org. It's virtual and in person. So I hope I see everybody there this afternoon. And thank you so much. What a great morning. I really feel rejuvenated and ready to get out and talk about Zionism again.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here. Bye-bye.
Right. Bye-bye.